Hey all, my name is Andrew Cox. I wanted to share with you a few of my thoughts and feelings about an issue that's very near and dear to me, and that is educational spending in the state of Utah. And I would preface it by saying this: Utah does not have an educational spending crisis. Utah has a hysteria crisis. I've heard cited, for as long as I can remember, that Utah does not spend as much money per pupil as any other state in the union, and this has been the case for over 30 years now. And while this is true, it really ignores some of the larger points and issues of the problem. I myself felt very convinced by all these arguments. I mean, shouldn't we as Utah, a state that has the lowest median age among all the states in the union, shouldn't we be spending more toward education? How is it that we're so far behind the national average, a total of about 4,000 behind the national average in per student spending? That's just unreasonable and illogical. Why would we as Utah, a state with so much focus towards children, why would we be in this predicament? So I've done a little bit of reading myself, trying to understand how this crisis could be. And as I was reading through Utah's budget, I stumbled across something I found very interesting. Utah has a total budget of $18.5 billion it can spend. That's what it had in 2019 at the least. And the numbers are around that, but slowly are going upwards. And of that $18.5 billion for the year of 2019, about $5 billion of those dollars were spent toward education, be it public or higher education. I can't think of any other state that comes even close to that, nor did I find any other state that spends about a third of its budget on education. None of them came even close to that. So I decided I would compare Utah to a different state in the union, the state of Iowa, which has a population of about 50,000 people fewer than the state of Utah. But there is one very big stark difference, and that is that the average age of someone in Iowa is about 8 years older than that of the person in Utah. So I chose Iowa because I imagine the budget is about the same, it's a very similar population, so it can face some of the variables that Utah has to face as well. So metaphorically, Utah has more mouths to feed than Iowa does. In fact, Utah has more mouths to feed than any other state in the union, with the youngest average age among all 50. Thus, a per pupil spending comparison will portray Utah as unconcerned for its youth and its students. Comparatively, however, Iowa spends less than 20% of its annual budget on education, with Utah being almost a third of all of its budget headed toward education. And even so, Iowa manages to have $4,000 more spent per pupil than the state of Utah. Utah has a hysteria problem, specifically our news outlets. Not once have I ever seen a news station reporting on these same statistics that I've just shared with you. They always just hammer that same nail on the head of Utah per pupil spending is lower than anywhere else. Just the same statistic over and over. Utah news outlets are more concerned with views and clicks than they are with spreading out real information and divulging true facts. In fact, Iowa, despite what I've said about its educational spending being way less than Utah, they still spend more than the national average on education. 5% difference, in fact. That's a big number. I'm not proposing we say the status quo is great. Utah's perfect. They don't need to change anything about their educational spending. I'm not saying we shouldn't change. I'm saying that news outlets need to broaden their horizons. They need to give a more fair perspective and a wider perspective about what's actually occurring instead of just pinpointing one fact and ignoring all others. It seems a little unfair, and it's what I would call fake news. In fact, let me just show you on my screen really quick how many different articles I found just bludgeoning to death the fact that Utah spends less per pupil than any other state. I would show you the ones where they say Utah spends a higher percentage of its budget than any other state, but none of those news outlets have a single article saying that.